what's the distinction between this kind of evolution of taste and, for lack of a better term, but philosophically problematic, true ugliness?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are really two prominent definitions of ugliness. One is that ugliness is the opposite of beauty. It is the most frequent one you hear. And it makes it's commonsensical. On the other hand, if beauty and ugliness can be brought together, then it's not easy simply to see it as the opposite of beauty. The other common definition is that ugliness is what we find repellent. Now, that also has some commonsensical appeal, but the problem with that, one of the problems with that definition is that, as you noted in your question, what is repugnant to us shifts over time. So Picasso's Guernica was rejected for exhibition at World Fair in 1937. Something else was substituted, a fairly kitschy work was substituted for it because it seemed too shocking and grotesque. Now people have Picasso as screensavers on their computers. It is accepted. There is an obvious shift over time. And it's not only over time. Simultaneously, you have different receptions of objects that might or might not be defined as ugly. An example would be photographs of lynchings. In the South, these were viewed as wonderful rituals and spectacles, representations of white nationalism and Black inferiority. In the North, they were found to be, rightly so, abject, ugly, horrific, outrageous, and they motivated those who wanted to eradicate injustice in the South. And then the question arises, if ugly is what we find repellent, is the same object ugly and beautiful depending on the reception? I would say no. I would say what we subsume under ugliness might shift, but ugliness is a concept that can be defined conceptually, so that what we subsume under ugliness shifts, but ugliness is stable. Concepts don't change over time, but what we subsume under the concept might change. And I view ugliness as, and this is a third definition that's not really that popular yet, but I view ugliness as, in a certain sense, a representation of something that contradicts the normative concept that belongs to that particular object. So I'll give you an example. We say it belongs to our normative expectations for the human mind, what the human mind should be. It should be listening, as you elevate in this podcast. It should be curious, which would apply to the listeners and viewers of your podcast and your show. And to the extent that information has been gleaned from such shows, the human mind should be knowledgeable. And that is a beautiful mind, to take it away from the film title. That is, the mind corresponds to the way the mind should be. Knowledgeable, curious, humble in embodying the virtue of good listening, and certainly eager to learn more and thus curious. Now, a figure who is, shall we say, arrogant, and so arrogant that they don't listen to others and therefore end up being stupid and are not at all curious, that is a form of intellectual ugliness. A particular example, since you mentioned Plato earlier, take the early dialogue of Plato on piety, Plato's Euthyphro. Socrates encounters Euthyphro, who's on his way to a court to try his father for injustice and impiety. Socrates is quite surprised. That's a rather radical decision on his part. Is Euthyphro confident that he has a good definition of piety? Euthyphro then goes through 4 different definitions of piety, each of which is refuted easily by Socrates. But Euthyphro doesn't recognize that he's wrong. And he flees the conversation because he doesn't want to be, to use a word that others might not use in this context, but Plato would, he doesn't want to be punished for having the wrong views, by having those ideas exposed as wrong. And so Euthyphro flees. He's not interested in the truth of piety. He's interested in holding on to his position. He's arrogant. He thinks he knows it still. That is intellectual ugliness. And part of defining ugliness in the first third of my book, I look at different spheres in which we find ugliness. Physical ugliness is fairly obvious. Emotional ugliness is not talked about much, but depression, rage, hostility that is unwarranted would be emotional ugliness. Then intellectual ugliness, and of course moral ugliness. And all of these can be subjects of artworks.